Well, obviously, as you say, there's two narratives that run through the whole book: germs and food, and they are related because, as you said, it's what we eat which helps to train the microbes, the millions of microbes in our guts, to work in a symbiotic way, in a helpful way. So it's not really a matter of switching things on and off, is it? It's more a matter of, as you say, not making them jumpy. So what, when it comes to what we eat, what should we avoid, and what are helpful from the point of view of macrophages? I'm not talking about sort of, what helps you build muscle or something, but just from this point of view of having a well-regulated immune system that doesn't then turn on you.
One of the best things that you can do to foster a diverse gut microbiome, a healthy gut microbiome, is to eat lots and lots of fiber from whole plant foods. And we've heard the advice to eat your vegetables for a long time now. And it's sort of something that people, yes, exactly. And people don't want to keep hearing that. It's sort of something that's been around for a while. But what we know today is that fiber is one of our most anti-inflammatory nutrients. It manipulates all arms of the immune system. And fiber from whole plant foods can directly influence immune cells, or it can do so through the gut microbiome. When you look at certain types of fiber, one is called soluble fiber. Soluble fiber is actually food for the gut microbes. So when microbes ingest the soluble fiber, they make very beneficial compounds like short-chain fatty acids, which nourish the gut barrier and calm inflammation. And these compounds don't just stay in the gut, they go all around your body. They travel to different organs, they go to the brain, they can affect mood. And it's very, very important to eat as much fiber as you can in order for those microbes to make the metabolites that are beneficial for the body. And it also helps to cultivate a cohort that is very diverse. And we know that diversity in the microbiome, as with any ecosystem, is a marker of health and is very important.
When you say that they produce chemicals which travel around your body, it sounds, if I've understood you right, that I mean, you tend to think of the signals that go around your body being ones that you make yourself. Your body makes them, but you're suggesting that it's all the people I live with in my gut. They're not me exactly, but they are sending the messages to me, to my body, to tell me how my body is and how it should be. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. They are controlling you in some ways. And there is a lot of truth to that statement. Your microbes can actually turn your genes on or off, which is an amazing thing to me. And they can do things, they can make metabolites that may affect your mood. And there are so many different ways in which microbes can impact your body. They harvest energy, they digest what you cannot digest, and they make vitamins, minerals. And when it comes to the immune system and inflammation, they play a central part in this low-level inflammation that's tied to modern chronic disorders, because a dysbiotic microbiome, or a microbiome that's in imbalance, is one that is not diverse, and very often that is an inflammatory microbiome. And here too, you see that it's what the microbes are doing. That's very important, because you can have identical microbiomes in someone, and you feed those microbiomes different things, and they behave very differently. The metabolites they make can be more inflammatory or less inflammatory. And that's a very interesting thought to me, because that tells one that you can change the behavior of the microbes in your gut just by changing what you eat, how you live your life.
But it's interesting, because at the present moment, we're used to the idea of thinking we are not interacting with the outside world the way we ought to. But what you're saying is we're not even interacting with the inside world the way we ought to.
That's absolutely true. We're not interacting appropriately with our inside world, the ecosystem that lives within us, and also the one that surrounds us. Because I think one of the most important things that we need to be doing in order to cultivate a healthy gut microbiome is contact with nature, and just being outside, even for a few minutes a day, but hopefully longer than that, even a few hours a week, has immeasurable benefits. And being outside allows you to come into contact with those microbes that evolved alongside humans in mud and water and rotting vegetation. And these are the microbes that train your immune system when you're young, especially. It's incredibly important to go into those forests and go on those hikes. So I say just let your kids get dirty and play in the mud and all of that. And it's something that we need to keep up as we age too, and all throughout our lives, because our microbes are having conversations with our immune cells at all hours of the day. And it's important to keep these conversations ongoing throughout life. And being in nature, connecting with those microbes can boost your immunity, can help to calm inflammation, creating more of an anti-inflammatory gut microbiome, and just do a variety of other things like lowering stress levels. And you're getting in some exercise as well on top of all of that. So.
Well, yes, when I read that section of the book, I could hear my granny's voice, because she was always very fond of saying, a little bit of dirt does you good. And in a way, that's what you're saying. And I was also thinking that after the COVID epidemic, when everyone was constantly disinfecting their hands, and I understand why, but for some people, it's continued on. And I can't help but think that on balance really going to be a good thing, unless you're a terribly vulnerable person, because as you say, you're not having any kind of conversation with all of those microbes that you need.
I absolutely agree. I think with hygiene, which we define as practices that are conducive to health, when we think of hygiene and the microbiome, we really need to think of context. So of course, if you're in the midst of a global pandemic and you want to decrease infectivity and you are sanitizing and washing your hands often, that is a very different thing than trying to live your day-to-day life a couple of years after the fact. And we still do need contact with those microbes in nature. But I would say, for example, if a child is visiting a lawn that's picture perfect and it seems like it's extremely manicured, you would wash your hands after that, but perhaps not when you're on those hikes in the forest. Probably don't need to wash your hands after that. You probably don't need to wash your hands after you do simple things around the house and such. But if you go to a hospital, of course, you do need to wash your hands after that. So I think context is very important, context and finding balance and finding ways to bring the outside into your home as well. So all of these things are things to think about.
Well, you also make the obvious point once you've said it, which is that the whole gut is the outside world in a sense, because it's the stuff that you think about, you put your clothes on the outside of you. And I'm always amazed by people who buy expensive clothes and cheap food. I think, surely that's the wrong way round.
Yes.
Surely it'd be much better to have a cheap shirt and a more expensive snack, because you're putting it is on it's a strange outside and inside, but surely what you say is that one of the most intimate places where we intimately interact with the outside world is in our gut, because the skin on your hand mostly just resists the outside world, but the skin on your gut takes it in.
Exactly. We are interacting with so much of the outside world when you look at the surface area of our gut. If you take the gut and kind of slice it apart, and I know this seems very gory of a picture. It sounds pretty bad, but if you do that and stretch it out, it would cover the surface of a small studio apartment. And that's kind of an amazing thing. We are interacting constantly with the outside world, and we almost can think of ourselves in plural rather than in the singular. And we have the gut microbiome, but we also have the skin microbiome. We have the microbes that are living around us. We have the microbes that live out in nature, and our boundaries are not as defined when we think of ourselves in this way. And it's interesting because when you look at the history of immunology and you look at how the discovery of macrophages defined our boundaries initially, it was us against the germs. This very discovery of a phagocyte, a macrophage in your body that could gobble up germs. It was a very exciting discovery for Mechnikov, and it really put the notion of self versus non-self into immunology. And now with the advent of the gut microbiome, all the research on the gut microbiome, especially since the turn of the century, we are realizing that, this isn't just about self versus non-self, but about a symbiotic relationship with so many of these microbes that surround us.
And I like the word you use, dysbiosis. So symbiosis, when we are working with all the things we're working with, and then you get dysbiosis when it's all out of whack. And a lot of what we eat does put it out of whack, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most insidious things that has really taken off over the last last few decades, certainly since the 1950s, is the rise of processed foods. And I think more so than any single whole foods, processed foods are probably the worst things that you can put into your body because they are incredibly addictive. They lead to sharp spikes in your blood sugar levels and deep crashes, stressing the body and eliciting tons of inflammation in the process. They are nutrient poor as well. They have unfavorable fats, and they're often made from whole food derivatives as opposed to whole foods themselves. And so the inclusion of all of those processed foods into the diet is I think, quite bad for our immune systems at large.
Yeah, I often think people are horrified if they spill Coca-Cola or grease on their floor. They think it's a major catastrophe, but they don't mind putting it inside themselves.
That's very funny, actually. Yes, that is very funny. Yeah, and I think it's this change from, back in the day, we used to just think of food as fuel. Food was fuel and fat was metabolically inert. These were all traditionally things that at one point we had imagined. And now we know that food is just far more than fuel. It's not just the amount of calories that you are ingesting, but it's the type of calorie and the type of food, and also the intrinsic qualities of a food, not just what kind of food it is, but how is it prepared? How close is it to a whole food? Are you fermenting the food? Are you soaking the food? Are you cooking the food or deep frying the food? All of these things play a part in the food's potential to elicit inflammation in the body. And I think that there is a language that transpires across the gastrointestinal border. And we know that food is a very powerful influence in this, and it can really help to train our immune cells to either be excitable or calm. And it can really help us to shape a microbiome that actually does good things for our bodies instead of harmful things.
You mentioned whole foods a couple of times. You never say the word food without having whole in front of it. And why do you prefer, you make a point of saying that you have to have whole foods, not food supplements?
Right. I think one of the reasons I talk about whole foods is that it can be so confusing with all of those dietary labels around. When you talk about the anti-inflammatory diet, you hear of gluten-free diets, you hear of paleo diets, you hear of vegan diets, and it's really confusing. And I think that any type of diet, no matter how you label it, can be either inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, depending on how you construct that diet. So are you including an appropriate amount of whole plant foods, for example? And the whole part comes in when you think about foods that are minimally processed. And so by minimally processed, I just mean that you're sauteing or baking the foods or eating them raw instead of doing sort of more aggressive cooking methods like deep frying the foods. So it's a difference between potato chips and French fries, which technically are from plants, and having an actual potato. So
French fries technically from a potato. We're not sure it actually is, but technically it is.
That's true. That's true.
Okay. All right. But you do also talk about that it's not all hopeless. I mean, there's lots of naturally occurring spices and foods. Can you tell us some of them that have there are things which you chemicals which you say calm the sort of the intestines.
Sure.
Tell us some of them.
Sure. So we have so many spices and herbs, and I think this is a category that we often forget about because we're used to thinking of food and plant foods and whole foods versus whole plant foods versus animal foods, but spices and herbs are a very, very important category. And we know, for example, even in clinical trials, that spices like curcumin, which is the active component of turmeric, can be very calming to the gut and can have anti-inflammatory effects. It helps to keep inflammatory bowel disease patients in remission. So curcumin is something that you can use very easily in cooking. You can just take a little teaspoon of turmeric and put it into a curry, for example. And we have so many other spices as well, cinnamon, ginger, cloves. In fact, if you make a chai tea for yourself in the morning and you infuse it with those types of spices, you're actually starting your day on an anti-inflammatory note.
For those people who think, well, maybe I've got this low level inflation, and I think I remember in the book that there is a marker. Is it something like CLP or something? I can't remember.
CRP, correct.
Is that something that you can actually go to your doctor and say, could you please give me a CLP test, test my blood for it? Is it, because I think it was the one that you said, look, it's not a bad proxy for indicating whether you've got this low level inflammation. Is that right?
Yes, so C-reactive protein, or CRP, is made by the liver in response to areas of inflammation. And in some cardiology clinics, they are starting to check something called high sensitivity C-reactive protein. And this checks even minute elevations of C-reactive protein. And it's a risk marker for developing heart disease. So that is useful to know in those cases. The problem with C-reactive protein can be that it's not very specific. That means that if you have a cold or the flu or something like that, then you may also have an elevated CRP. So, and that tends to be the problem with a lot of the inflammatory markers that we have now, and hopefully that will change in the future one day. But often they don't tell you why you are inflamed, where it's coming from the body, or how long the inflammation has been there for. So that's still a work in progress. The things that you can do if you go to your primary care physician's office, they can take a look to see if you have belly fat. And that's a very simple way of knowing if you have something called visceral fat, which is a fat that wraps around your inner abdominal organs. And it's this type of fat that it's very inflammatory. So if you have some of that belly fat, then you do know that most likely you have some level of silent inflammation. If the doctor checks your blood sugar levels and you have elevated blood sugar levels or diabetes, then you know that most likely you do also have some level of silent inflammation. So these are good proxies for that.
I was interested that when you were talking about fat, because most people think of fat as it's undesirable unless you're having to go swimming in the North Sea, where I live, in which case it's essential. But you make the point that it's not just a layer of blubber that you carry around, but I think you said in some ways it is an inflammatory organ because of the way the macrophages in fat are. Is that right?
Right. And it's not really so much the fat that pads your thighs or your upper arms. It's more the belly fat that's probably the most toxic. And fat tissue is absolutely, it can be seen as an immune organ. In the markedly obese folks, over half of the cells in their fat are actually immune cells, like macrophages, and
so they're not fat cells. They're not
right.
Adipose. Oh, right. Half of
right.
it.
And the fat cells in that fat are also spewing out cytokines and inflammatory proteins. So in the markedly obese folks, you do have, the macrophages and other immune cells that spew out those cytokines as well as the fat cells. And your fat can be seen as an immune organ, and it's something to definitely keep in mind. And this is not to say that the focus should be just on weight loss, because we know that even in the absence of weight loss, so even if your body looks exactly the same and you have that belly fat, but you go out and you're exercising, that can actually decrease the number of immune cells that infiltrate your fat tissue. So exercise has positive effects, even if you're not seeing any of those effects with your eyes. It can dampen silent inflammation, even if you are not seeing that weight loss.
Then why do we have silent inflammation then? Why can't we just get rid of it?
That would be lovely in order to, if we could have that magic pill again. And I think, what's been happening is that we've evolved these robust inflammatory responses to deal with all of those ancient problems that beset us, the frequent germs and the poisons and the traumas. And we had to do that in order to survive those things. But over the decades, over the years, we've also just transformed our environments, and we have a wealth of all of these tasty processed foods around. We are eating very, very differently than we did long ago, and we transform the ways in which we move. We are not getting enough exercise, and the air we breathe, pollution is a big problem as well. The clothes we wear, the household products we use could also have inflammatory triggers in them. And so we've transformed our environments. So chronic low-level inflammation is in some ways a result of this mismatch between the ecological niche that we evolved to inhabit and the one that we currently inhabit. And we see this in the rise of chronic disorders over the years. We have a huge burden of obesity in the Western world. And at the same time, people are still aware that we do need to drastically change our diets and our lifestyles.
Yes, I mean.